Hello, my name is Deborah and I am the author of the Babbage Parallel series, Reflections on the Decline of Belief in Science and Religion. Now I have a very special guest with me here to discuss actually the differences between the United States and the UK when it comes to the emergency medical services, but also civilian and military issues. So without further ado, may I introduce to you Robert Lawrence.
Hello, thank you for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you so much. Could you talk to us a little bit about your history in the field so that people understand who you are?
Yep, so I'm talking to you today from the middle of Las Vegas, which is where I live, not on the strip, but actually off in the metropolis that is Las Vegas. So back initially, I was an officer in the British Army, a graduate of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and I did that for 20 years. And then joined the National Health Service ambulance service, and I was in the medical corps in the military. And so then I joined the National Health Service and was the chief operating officer and also the operations director of the two services in the east of England and East Anglia. And then I emigrated to work in Richmond, Virginia for 10 years. And Richmond is the capital city of Virginia. It's also a classic inner city that you would imagine watching, television on sort of crime and EMS response in America as one of those places, and then moved across to California, to the city of Oakland, and to the West Bay. In other words, anything the East Bay, anything to the east of San Francisco. And then I left operational EMS, and amongst my roles now, I'm actually the executive director of the California Ambulance Association. So I represent ambulance and EMS well-being legislation, HR law, company organization for ambulance companies across California. California, of course, is a state that is as large as England, with about a third of the population. So it's a good job.
That's amazing. I think what would be really interesting to ask first actually would be how do you feel that your military education impacts your work ethic as a person of a high level of discipline?
I think it's interesting because when people think of people that are former soldiers or former military people, they think it's abject discipline, left, right, tick tock, etc. But actually, it couldn't be any further from the truth, because being a former soldier and actually being educated in the ways of military, it's actually a cerebral activity. It's about how to think, how to interpret, how to understand, how to anticipate, how to act and react in the military sense faster than the opposition, but also in business. It's an ability to how to react to the business you're in. These days, businesses have mission statements, they have vision statements. Guess where they got those from? Okay, and so it actually prepares you, I think, for civilian life. My mindset now was educated in that sort of thought process. And so it's about the ability to think, to act, and to react in anything that you do.
That's so interesting. It sounds like the concepts like reconnaissance, for example, are so important. But it's so interesting that you describe acting before the enemy and how in business that could be
Mhm.
useful. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on
Yeah.
an example of that, how that might look.
Well, first of all, you mentioned reconnaissance, and it was the Duke of Wellington that said time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. In other words, before you do anything, you should have a look, you should have a think, you should perhaps test the situation, and then you'll be more successful on the day. So in 1815, he was quite right. Reconnaissance is a good thing. Um, these days, it's all business and military operations are all about the decision action cycle. Okay, if you can move faster, think faster, and react quicker than the thing that you're trying to defeat or achieve, then of course it makes you successful. And that sounds very American, that I want to be successful at everything, but actually business is about success, right? And so that kind of cerebral activity and the ability to anticipate and think is a key activity. And certainly for a leader, having time to think is also actually not just a leader, but allow yourself thinking time, because you can then go through those processes of selection and maintenance of your aim, working out what you want to do to achieve it, working through the issues that you've anticipated, and then turning it into action. And then when you turn things into action, you go through a plan, do, study, act cycle where you plan something, you do it for a little, you study it, and then you act upon it, and then you grow it. And so there's a number of principles that are good no matter what color uniform or suit you wear.
Do you find that when you're working to a high level within EMS, particularly, um, do you notice significant differences between how those systems actually work in the UK and the USA? Do you find that you have to change somewhat the way you work in those areas, or do you find that actually across the board there's a real similarity, particularly in the West?
I think all sort of first world countries, let's call them that, have a very similar approach to ambulance services and to emergency medical services. At the end of the day, at the beginning of the call, you have a person that's having an emergency. Now, it may not be life-threatening, but it may be most certainly the worst day in their life. And so the first action is to react to that, whether it's just from a call and a call center and a sort of call taking disposition. So you may not need an ambulance on blue lights and sirens, but actually I may be able to make you an appointment at your GP, or there may be some sort of urgent care solution. Everyone does that in the first world. We are sending and dispatching ambulances or first responders to locations. That happens everywhere in the first world. Of course, the challenge these days is A, recruiting and retention of staff, and B, the sheer volume and demand that's being placed upon healthcare services. It's exactly the same in the US as it is in the UK. I'm sorry to say, the population is aging, and therefore the population's healthcare needs are increasing. And, sadly, there isn't the infrastructure growing and building as fast to deal with that. And that's a first world issue that's going on no matter whether you're in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, or indeed the US. So the task is the same. I went, as I said, from the East of England ambulance service across to the United States. The good news is that the call taking methodology is the same. The way that you dial 911 or 999, the way that the call taker answers and processes the call by asking very important key questions. Are you conscious and breathing? If you are not the patient, can you do CPR, etc.? So those things are the same because it's a standard and it works. The dispatch of ambulances is fairly similar. The difference between the US and the UK is in the UK, it's pretty much exclusively ambulance services that respond. And of course, those amazing people that are civilian first responders, community first responders. In the US, it's ambulance services and fire departments. Every firefighter is trained as an EMT. So in the UK, you wouldn't see a fire engine going to something that's fairly low acuity. These days, I hope they go out to things like cardiac arrests, but fire departments here in the USA conduct that first response and also conduct in some bigger cities, New York, Los Angeles, Boston, ambulance transport as well. And so, everybody that's a first responder is responsible for first responding here. In the UK, it's a little bit more compartmentalized. So those are exceptional similarities. The one thing, of course, that I had to come to grips with is in the UK, the notion of the National Health Service is quite simple, and that is that healthcare is free at the point of delivery. In the US, it's an insurance-based model. And so whilst we will not refuse to go to somebody, then of course the part and parcel of that interaction is, can I have your insurance card, please? Or can I have your Medicare card, which is Social Security by another name? And then of course, that's how income is generated for an ambulance service. So you only get paid for transport in the US. In the UK, of course, it's all done through national taxation. Everybody works for the National Health Service. We all have the same boss, and it all comes down from government funding from the top down. In the US, you actually gain funding from transporting people from either the government, Medicare, Medicaid resources, or indeed insurance. So that's actually, for me, that was the hardest bit to get my head around, how reimbursement occurs in an ambulance service. But actually the operations are exceptionally similar.
That's interesting. So when you describe the ambulance service itself and how they get paid, does that link to a centralized system? So those ambulance services are linked to a hospital which is taking in that income and then it's distributed? Or is it specifically the ambulance service that is sort of a private entity?
There's a great saying here in the US that once you've seen one ambulance system, you've seen one ambulance system. And so you have hospital-based EMS systems. You have some, as I said, that are fire-based. You have a lot of private companies that provide ambulance services. You have sort of not-for-profit systems. And so there's a whole multitude. But in simple terms, no matter how you are constructed and made up, the reimbursement comes primarily from the insurance or private healthcare. And so a lot of private ambulance companies, and in my current role with the California Ambulance Association, I represent the private ambulance companies of California, and their job is to provide emergency medical response and also transport to hospital, and also what we call IFT, interfacility transport, because think of when a patient has finished their time in hospital. Once the patient has come through their treatment, they then need to go somewhere, whether it's to a step down facility to recover, to recuperate. Then, of course, the interfacility transport ambulance, and in the UK you'd call it PTS, patient transport services, would take that patient away. So there's a whole sort of, there's the emergency piece, there's the transfer piece, and of course then there's the critical care transfer piece, where you may require a nurse or some enhanced level of transportation to take a patient from A to B. And so those are all sort of also part and parcel of the healthcare delivery, again, to a degree, both in the UK and also in the US.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder how those systems have changed over, say, the last 20 years. What do you think are the most major and profound changes, either technologically or developmentally, that have changed the way you work as an EMT?
Well, first of all, of course, treatments have changed. These days, we now are training everybody to do CPR. We've changed the way that we train people to do CPR. Before, you had to remember how many times you pressed versus how many times you breathe. And that gets kind of confusing. Well, from a bystander or a layperson perspective, the key is push hard and fast. I can teach you to do CPR effectively now. Ready? Here we go. Push hard and fast. Call 999. Keep pushing hard and fast until help arrives. Any questions? You now can deliver CPR. And so by having that mentality and having in the UK community first responders, every red telephone box either has a library in it or a defibrillator. Excellent. This is brilliant, because you now know where to. So you know how to do CPR. I've just given you a 30-second lesson. You now know that your local telephone box, red box, has a defibrillator in it. You can actually go and get that, and you can start the whole process of what's called the chain of survival: CPR, arrival of ambulance services, paramedics with drugs and transport to a hospital, and then of course intensive care in hospital. And so these basic things are, and so things change, because we actually, it's everybody's responsibility pretty much now to go and learn CPR in order to save a life, which increases the amount of lives saved. I used to be in Virginia for 10 years. They actually changed the law to say you didn't get your high school diploma unless you'd taken a CPR class first. In Seattle, in a city, they have the notion that even at kindergarten, even at junior school, you learn how to use 911, 999, what to ask for, who to ask for, and it progresses up through there. So we're being really good at self-help. So that's increased survivability, which is good. Of course, cardiac arrest is possibly one of the worst things that can happen. In terms of drugs and applications and treatments and paramedic education, that is improved in the UK now, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Norway. Everyone that's a paramedic primarily now has a 4-year paramedicine degree. They are exceptionally well educated, not only in life-saving, but also in primary care and also in public health. And so you're getting a much more well-rounded individual. And so paramedic education has increased. The technology that we're using, of course, has also moved along quite nicely too. So, thinking about how we look after the medic or the ambulance person, right? Back in the day, you had these sort of metallic stretchers, or you carried a 1914, canvas stretcher, the two of you, not good for your back. We then moved on to more, metal ones with wheels, still not good for your back. Now we have systems that either raise and lower themselves, or indeed put the patient into the back of the ambulance, or indeed, dare I say, you lower the back of the ambulance. I mean, what's that got to do with healthcare? Well, actually, it's keeping our medics healthy, because the biggest form of disablement and retirement from ambulance services is musculoskeletal, right? Because I always joke when I go and talk. I don't joke. It's not a joke. I shouldn't joke about this. I always talk to medics and say, put your hand up if you remember the day your back went. right? Because that's the thing, you're doing a lot of manual handling, and therefore to increase or to make life easier is a key activity in order to help us keep the workforce healthy, in order to be there to respond, in order to save more lives. Of course, we are starting to also see more use of the telephone, whereas before you called 999, they said an ambulance man will be with you shortly, or the ambulance driver. By the way, medics hate being called ambulance drivers because actually they are medically trained personnel. Driving is just the adjunct to get you there. There we go. Let's get that one out. And so, we are seeing the advent of technology. AI is starting to come in terms of aiding, patient care reporting. Of course, every time you treat somebody, you have to write you have to complete the log or the register or the electronic patient care report on what you actually did, because that becomes part of the wider healthcare record. So the advance of AI now in terms of hearing what I'm saying to you, some actually body-worn cameras that police are using here in the US can detect body language, can actually lip read. I mean, it's the speed now with which AI is coming in is remarkable. When you do an ECG, a 12-lead ECG on the patient, you see the patient with all the 12 dots all over them. Of course, a good medic can interpret that strip and that rhythm to understand what's happening with the heart, but also now AI can also offer a diagnosis, a differential diagnosis. So technology is moving along, is moving along at an amazing rate. Of course, the issue is your local ambulance trust or my local ambulance company doesn't have a bottomless budget to keep buying enhancements and enhancements and enhancements. So we have to work out a way in which we can continue to move along with the technological advancement and also afford it, because developers are developing it to sell it to us. If we can't afford it, we can't have it. And the government, I could say from the UK, aren't going to be chipping in every month for something new. The latest, greatest thing has to be budgeted for, has to be tested, has to be implemented. And these things take time. And sometimes, the general public, when they ask, well, why didn't you have this technology? It's because if you've got to buy 10,000 of them or whatever, you've got a budget for it. You've got to appeal. Someone's got to give you the money. It's got to be granted. The procurement cycle has to be gone through, and sometimes we can't keep up with the speed of technology. So that's a challenge.
That's really interesting. Do you find that these technological advances are actively increasing the longevity of your personnel? Are you seeing that already, or do you perhaps perceive that that will be the case increasingly, particularly with technology that helps them to avoid lifting more than they can lift, for example?
I Yeah, I sincerely hope so. Of course, we've all in the healthcare world had a bit of a setback with COVID, because a lot of people in the healthcare environment went, actually, this is pretty risky and I'm getting near the end, and I'm going to walk away and retire or get some other job that doesn't involve me being cheek by jowl with someone that could, through no fault of their own, breathe on me and kill me. And we've seen a lot of people that have relocated out of healthcare. And this is where our paramedic shortage has happened. Certainly paramedic and healthcare workers shortage has happened in the US, because a lot of people, and we rely a lot on volunteer. In rural areas, we have a lot of volunteer systems. Think about St. John's Ambulance in the UK. Well, we badge them as firefighters or EMTs and paramedics here in the US. A lot of the volunteer companies were going, actually, no, this is enough. I can't do this anymore. And so we've now created the term which we call ambulance deserts. There are certain places in the US for which are more than 40 miles away from a hospital, or there's little to no EMS response at the moment, because the volunteers are no longer volunteering. The noble notion by which they came to volunteer a weekend or a few hours or a night shift has gone, sadly. And so we're trying to fix that now with again, increased funding. Where does increased funding come from? Reimbursement. And so those are some very real challenges that we have that we're trying to work our way through. But yeah, technology will make life easier. And hopefully, as we start to now recruit people, and as I mentioned to you before we started, recording, that one of the big initiatives at the moment in the US is to attract certainly Australians. And if you're a UK paramedic and you want to come and work in the US, hit me up, because obviously we have to work through E3 visa programs. And also the paramedicine in the US is governed by a thing called the National Registry, which sets the standard of testing by which you have to certify and qualify. and you have to, as we say here, challenge the test. So you have to go through the National Registry of EMT tests in order to, but if you can do those two things, then there's an opportunity to come and work in the US. What advantage do you get there? Well, we have some interesting inner cities that has some interesting challenges and problems, and certainly will give you a different view to perhaps working in, as I used to, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire, very rural areas with some very, unique healthcare in its own right. But again, it's an opportunity to travel. Australians are coming over now more significantly. Interestingly, Australian universities, every university has a paramedic program, and they're overproducing medics right now. And so there's more medics than there are jobs. And so, of course, they've been coming to the UK for a long time. There's total reciprocity between Australia and the UK. The certifications, qualifications, degrees are the same, and you can come and work straight away in the UK. And London has a lot of Australians, for example, London Ambulance Service. We're hoping to replicate that here in the US as well, as we try to replace those that we've lost.
Right. Do you find that this is a similar system in both military and civilian emergency services?
It's interesting, actually, because a lot of people have asked me that question. And of course, the subtle difference between a military operation and a civilian operation is, in the military, I know where the casualties are going to occur, because we're planning and operating in an environment where it's very sharp, very pointed, and very discreet. Back in the Gulf War, there was a great British general. His name was General Rupert Smith, and he said that a good plan, there's only one certain outcome of any operation, and that is casualties. If it's a good plan, it's their casualties. If it's a bad plan, it's our casualties. And that's quite profound, but it's quite true. So in other words, in a military operation, you are focusing on the point of the operation and then planning how you evacuate somebody from that point, the sharp end of the spear, back to a point of evacuation and then repatriation. And so I had a very good friend over visiting not so long ago, Captain Kate Pryor, Royal Navy, who was responsible for the MERT, the Medical Emergency Response Team in Afghanistan. And the principle was quite simple, that we know an operation is going on here, and therefore we have to plan first to evacuate any casualties, any wounded, immediately from that point back to what's called a Roll 1 unit, which is the tent in the desert that has surgeons and anaesthetists in it that conducts what they call aggressive surgical resuscitation. In other words, we're going to arrest the bleeding, we're going to clamp things we need to clamp, we're going to make the patient survive in order to move them back. Because that planning and preparation was so effective, they actually had this thing which they called unexpected survivors. Back in the day, if somebody was blown up with an improvised explosive device or had some sort of artillery event, etc., then the chances of their survival were slim. These days, people that have horrific injuries are being evacuated very, very quickly, receiving that aggressive surgical resuscitation and moved back very effectively through the chain of evacuation system. And so the military is good at that, because you have a little bit of an advantage because you know where the operation's at. Also, because of Afghanistan and because of Iraq, actually treatments and procedures and understanding and the way that we treat trauma victims particularly has now informed the civilian trauma world. Because in Bagram in Afghanistan, they are doing not a trauma a month that you might do in the UK or a trauma a day that you might do in the US. They're doing them in 5s and 10s. And so the learning from that has informed trauma surgery pretty much around the world. So that's the military. Civilian, of course, we don't actually, we have a good idea of where incidents and accidents are going to occur, because believe it or not, humans are creatures of habit. You're a creature of habit, Deborah. Let me tell you why. Because you go to bed at a certain time, you wake up at a certain time, you drive your car to work at a certain time, you stop for lunch, you go home, you go out to socialize on a Friday night. And so there's actually a trend and a pattern to your behavior. And if you can add you to the rest of the population in the area in which you live, we can start to measure your behavior, and we can start to see when there are peaks of the day. Combine that to when hospitals are also creatures of habit, because they normally discharge their patients in the afternoon, which means there's a demand on ambulances to transport in the afternoon. So you can almost create a wave of activity. And by that, you can work out when you need ambulances and resources, and also from a geographical perspective where these things happen. In the evenings, we're all at home. In the daytime, before we all could work from home, of course, we're all in the city and town, and so there's actually a time and a space analysis that you can do to actually make it reasonably predictable of when an emergency is going to occur. And so there's, this is a great science and technology activity, in fact, because we'd always joke that in the city of Richmond, again, joke is the wrong word, but there was almost a predictive analysis of whether it's a shooting encounter or indeed traffic accidents, because people are crashing on the way to work, crashing on the way home. It's one of those things where we can use data and turn it into an intelligence product.
That's really interesting. I wonder if, particularly working in military EMS, it's really a fantastic option for finding out just how much stress you can handle within reason, seeing that you can respond to really high level situations very quickly and very pragmatically. And then with the civilian EMS, I wonder if you went from military to civilian, that perhaps civilian you would find yourself perhaps more prepared for, as opposed to going the
I
other way.
think I think it's reasonably fair to say that, but then of course don't forget that everybody involved in emergency medical services, ambulance services, whether you're a civilian or a military, your job is to be there at the very worst moment of that one person's life, and that one person has that life-changing event once. The medic is there 8-9 times a day, all year, all career, and so eventually they're the level of stress, the level of the level of upset, the level of uncertainty actually is a very real thing, whether you're civilian or military. Military is very, very, very focused on a short time in a potentially a short career. Ambulance folk are there for the long haul, and so of course it's a function of leadership, it's a function of administration, it's a function to make sure that you looking after your people, that the pastoral care of those individuals is absolutely paramount. It's a function of leadership to do that, because people do suffer from burnout. It's no secret, and I tell people I've seen more gunshot wounds as an EMS leader in America than I ever saw in the military. Because it's the nature of where we live. But the point being is that therefore everybody has a high degree of stress in doing their job, because your job is to be cool, calm, collected, proficient, clinically excellent every time you go out, which could be 12 times a day. And so that's a lot of stress and a lot of pressure on that person to be there and deliver an excellent service and to make the right decisions, because of course, again, I talked about cerebral activity. It's a thinking activity to try and, diagnose. Paramedicine, particularly, is a friend of mine calls it the patient is unselected. You haven't worked out whether they need cardiology, whether they need to see, to see the kidney specialist or to see the heart specialist or see whoever. The medic is the jack of all trades, because they've got to work out very quickly what's up and how do I treat that, and then take you to hospital when then they will have, you've got the two guys on the ambulance, and all of a sudden now you've got 20 people in an emergency room or an ED or an A&E, however you call it, who are all experts in their field now, replacing those two people. And so it's a heck of a job, a hell of a vocation, and actually a stressful challenge.
How do you recommend in those circumstances that your personnel or other people going into the field should look after their mental health?
I think, firstly, the old notion of, my grandfather, your grandfather were of that era where you just kept it to yourself, you bottled it up, you didn't share, you didn't wish to be a burden. It's all too much trouble for me to tell you these things. That has changed, and it has to change because of the stresses of, A, living in the modern society, B, the job that you do. There has to be those kind of buddy systems. There has to be employee assistance programs. There has to be, we spend a lot of time talking about the role of the chaplaincy, for example. I came from the military where the padre was that one person you could go to with your problems and it not leach into the chain of command, for example. We have the chaplaincy in EMS, certainly in the US, where, the the father, the vicar, as I say, they have many names, but actually their role is to be there for you, the provider, to offer you the pastoral care in order to help you cope with the next call. And I think there's a big place for that. But also it's a function of leadership to make sure that your people are looked after, to make sure that they're well rested, to make sure that they don't return back to work, too soon after their last shift. And so there's a lot of leadership and a lot of pastoral care that's required to look after people that do such stressful jobs.
That's so interesting that you describe lots of different aspects from the leadership level to the individual
Yeah,
themselves to work together to ensure that that
yeah,
person is in the best place, that that person has people to talk to and
hmm,
knows that that's a good idea to do that if they're
yes,
struggling, and for leadership to put things in place that make it possible for them to do that and that not lead to negative
yeah.
consequences for them to go into their shifts when they're ready to do them, etc. I wonder also, what are actually the intense rewards of being in the field as well?
You know what? Some people say this isn't a job, it's a way of life. First of all, it's a calling. We do it because we want to help. Again, we want to help that person who is having the worst day of their life. We want to be there to make a difference. Of course, the absolute rewards are when you meet somebody that you've saved, when you meet the baby that you've delivered. And I certainly have met, folk that I have defibrillated later. And it is a humbling moment to realize that you were able to be a part of that. I met medics that have babies named after them, not because they fathered them, but because they saved them or delivered them. um, and just to see that is awesome, humbling, inspirational, and makes you want to do more. And so, that's the way of life. That's what we sign up for. Because yes, it's stressful, but actually sometimes those rewards far outweigh the trouble of doing the job sometimes. And you ask any medical person, why are you doing it? I can tell you they're not doing it for the money, first of all, period. But actually, the ability to make a difference in somebody's life is immense.
I wonder with certain people who are watching this who might be interested in healthcare in general or
Yeah.
specifically this field. I wonder if they could hear that and wonder about what the future is going to look like. So we know that the world is changing very rapidly, and young people are desperately trying to think, which career shall I go into? Which ones are going to
Mhm.
last? So some jobs are going to sort of whittle away with technological advances. What would you say to someone who's interested in being a paramedic, for example?
Well, mindset, first of all, are you the person that wants to make a difference? Because if you are not, then perhaps this isn't the job for you. It's not just one of those things you put up with because you are involved intimately in somebody's life all the time. And it could be in the palace or indeed a literally in the ditch under the bridge in the rain, as we always say, in the alleyway by the dumpster, right? So you are going to be involved with the whole cross section of society, and your job is to make the difference for them on that moment. And so, firstly, the mindset, the attitude, the approach to why you're there is absolutely key. Um, being a good, community servant is absolutely essential. No matter which country you're in, you have to have that mindset and that attitude first. Obviously, that it's a scientific activity. Paramedicine requires you to know, a little bit of everything clinically and medically, because you're going to see everything clinically and medically in the course of your normal day. And so therefore it's an opportunity to, to learn, to understand, to become a competent medic and clinician. And in the UK, of course, there are now many universities that run paramedicine courses. As I'm talking about Australia, they actually run crossover registered nurse paramedic degree programs. So you can go either or. But obviously, having that education and being a student ambulance paramedic, is a noble profession. As I say, we're not doing it for the money. Let's just be very clear. But actually, we're doing it for the calling, and sometimes that's far more than you could ever earn.
Thank you so much for that. I think this is going to be so interesting to people, not only those who want to go into healthcare, but those who look from the outside and wonder what's going on with these professions and how
Mhm.
are these differences that they read about online,
Yeah.
particularly between the United States and the United Kingdom, how do they play out? And hopefully this discussion will really lay all of that very clear and straight for those who are interested. So I'm very grateful to you for joining me today, and thank you to everyone who's listening. And how can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter or X at UKRobL1. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn as well. And if you go to ems1.com and type my name in, I also broadcast, write, report, vodcast about healthcare in the US there. So ems1.com and then type my name in the search, Rob Lawrence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.